All right, so let's talk about the history. We're going to go way back. So this was Chinese influence, really going back to sort of like, pre-Common Era, sort of China to find some evidence that they were using tests even way back then. And the talk about the influence of Darwin. Charles Darwin, and Galton was Darwin's cousin. I think cousin, yeah. And really looking at this idea that even though people share a lot of the same common things, right? We are more alike in terms of DNA and all kinds of stuff than we are different. Yet some of those individual differences are more adaptive than others, right? They'll lead to more successful offspring and stuff like that. So Darwin's interest in that led to Galton really trying to measure and actually quantify a lot of these individual differences. That led to sort of more experimental psychologists who were influenced by Galton. And then this whole idea of mental deficiency came into play, and people were interested in trying to identify those who were mentally deficient, and why that sort of drove a lot of the testing forward to getting to intelligence tests. And then there was a sort of rise of the objective and subjective, or objective and projective personality tests and that kind of stuff. And then we get to sort of the more current environment in terms of testing. So just quick. 2000 BCE. So BCE is before Common Era. So instead of using AD and BC or whatever, this BCE is like BC, and CE is now Common Era is like AD. Make sense? I think something like that. So 2000 BC, so hell of a long time ago. Okay, so we're talking about 4,000 years ago, something like that. There's scattered evidence of civil service testing in China. So the idea is that let's develop tests so we can actually put people into the correct job. So people have different skills. Let's figure out what those skills are, and then we can actually then put them into to civil service of some sort in order to sort of optimize their ability. Okay, so moving forward, you get to 206 to 220, 206 BCE to 220 CE. There's evidence that the Han Dynasty in China develops test batteries. So they started to do not just one test now, but they started actually using a bunch of tests in conjunction with one another to look at things like civil law, military affairs, agriculture, revenue, geography. And all this was, again, to hold office or to be put into a civil service sort of job. You had to sort of take these tests and pass them, and depending on where you scored is where you'd be placed in your position and what kind of things you would be able to do. So moving even forward, 1368 to 1644, there's some evidence that they developed multi-stage. The Ming Dynasty developed multi-stage testing, and here's the thing: they start to put more and more weight on these tests. So local tests lead to provincial capital tests, and capital tests lead to national capital tests, so that only those that passed and were moved up to these tests were eligible for public office. Like, you had to pass these things to even be eligible to hold public office or to be able to hold certain jobs. They started to put more and more weight on these types of tests. Right? 1832, the English East India Company that copies this Chinese system. They start to use this system to select employees for overseas duty. So there's more and more sort of tests related to occupation. These are sort of occupational placement type tests, and more of that starts happening. But it was really the influence of what China at the time was doing that led to the English to sort of to adopting that same kind of system. Right? Has anybody ever taken an occupational test? Like, you go do a job, you got to do a bunch of tests before they'll actually give you a position, or anybody done that before? No? All right. You probably will. It's very common. It's getting more and more common all the time, where you got to go through. Looks like maybe Jessica has. So Jessica, can you tell me a little bit about that? What was the scenario there? Yeah. Oh, right. It was supposed to tell you what kind of occupation you should go into. Yes, yes, yes. Yeah, I was thinking this, there were similar things I remember as a kid too. They're, oh, you should be an auto mechanic. You should be this, depending on how you answer these sort of sets of questions. And I look back, I think this stuff's so ridiculous to think that that's even the case. But it was a way. It was their way of trying to help you figure out what you want to do for a living or what you want to do with the rest of your life by telling you like, oh, you don't need to go to college. You should go, dig ditches for a living or whatever weird thing we come back to as a way of sort of tell you what occupation you should do. And really what anybody should do when they get information back to that is do the exact opposite of whatever the hell it said, probably. But you think about that. So there's one thing to take a test to sort of be suggestive for you. It's another for you to take that test and for other people to then take that at face value, objective value, and then make decisions about what you're able to do and where you can go based simply on your responses to a bunch of questions. And that's what sort of was going on in the sort of Ming Dynasty and later on in the the English East India Company, where they were making decisions about what people could do what jobs depending on how they scored. Okay, so again, they were taking this stuff at face value as if it was objectively correct and really reflected people's abilities and their ability to be successful in a position in a company, in a large company like that one. 1855, British adopts this English East Company. So the Britain as a whole now starts to adopt that same the same selection examinations. The French and German government starts to follow shortly after that. In the United States, establishes the American Civil Service Commission and administered competitive examinations for government service jobs. So what started in China spread to the English East India Company, then to France and Germany, and now it was coming over to the United States, and we were doing the same thing. Right, the United States was now trying to figure out, and by the way, if you go into the military, this is still a very prominent thing. You actually take tests at the very beginning. They're supposed to figure out what kind of job in the military you would be good at. Should you be, on the front lines? Should you be a medic? Should you be this? It's all based on a lot of these sort of tests that they do in the very beginning. It's not like you get to choose. Hey, I want to be this. I want to be that. I mean, you do to a certain degree, and you can actually go to school to a certain degree for different things. But for a lot of it, they actually will tell you what kinds of jobs are available to you based on how you actually do on these sort of these service job sort of examinations they still use. So that's Darwin there. So Darwin, of course, is the survival of the fittest. The whole Darwinism thing. So again, lots of individual differences between people. No two humans are exactly alike. So he was interested in sort of why that was. And he saw that some individual differences between people or between species and things were more adaptive, and that led them to sort of share their genetic material and reproduce. This sort of interest in what was his book? The book he wrote, The Origins of Man or something like that. That was his famous book. Led to all kinds of interest in this idea of individual differences and adaptive traits. So his cousin, Galton, he's what you call an applied Darwinist. So Darwin really was sort of more of a theoretical Darwinist, right? He thought about this more theoretically. He actually then started to take those principles and test them and actually put them into more applied settings. He wrote a book called Hereditary Genius in 1869, sets up an anthropometric, it's a cool word too, anthropometric laboratory at the International Expedition of 1884. What they would do is they would put out, I think it's on the next page, they would put out these advertisements that people come in and they would just measure them. And they were basically looking to see what was the variation in human responses. How did people actually do things differently depending on who they were, and what was the range of responses they can get from people. So they would come into this laboratory here, and they would have them just do a whole bunch of different things, different tests, different things. Just what they were looking for was, all right, what's the ranges in which people can actually do this? So they would actually play sounds. There was this Galton whistle, right? They would actually play different sounds on this to see what range there was for human hearing. They would actually have people estimate length given the sort of Galton bar. How long is this? How whatever. They would actually show it on that to see what was their variation in their with the guessing length and things, all kinds of goofy stuff, just to figure out what people could do and what their range of responses were like. But that was one of the first times where people started to really to document what these things look like, what the individual differences actually were between people, so I think the funny thing too is that they charged them for 3 pence. Right? Visitors could be measured with. They would go in and just, it was for them. It was like, oh, I get to have fun goofing around with these different things that we're doing, and they were the whole time sort of taking measurements and just got a huge amount of data and the variation of individual differences between different people. That was what he was really interested in. All right, let's see. Talk about that. Everybody, any questions about this? So we just really, there was really no. They weren't trying to manipulate people or do any kind of experimentation. It was really just having people come in, give their responses to document what the range of human variability was across the board on a number of these different things. So Galton also noted that persons with mental retardation also tend to have diminished ability to discriminate among things like heat, cold, and pain. Whether that's true, and I don't know, but he actually this is something he started to study this more and more because he actually noticed that they weren't very good at doing these types of things. So he thought that was somehow indicative of a person who had mental retardation. Okay, so so it says advances with a question mark because they're not really advances totally, but other advances of Galton's was considered by some the founder of Psychometrics. So this idea that he was going through and measuring people's reactions, their abilities, just their variation in these different responses. So he was basically they see as the founder, the first person to really take psychological measures like that. He pioneered things like rating scales and questionnaires. So before that, there really wasn't a whole lot of that going on. So he pretty much pioneered that approach. He was the first to document individuality of fingerprints. He was first to notice that people's fingerprints differed from person to person. There were no two fingerprints look alike. He did a study on the efficacy of prayer, like how does prayer actually work. He actually studied that. First to apply statistics in the measurement of humans. A lot of people have been using it studying animals. He was the first one to really, use it for human respondents, human subjects, and he was the founder, one of the first people to put forward this idea of eugenics. Let me know what eugenics is. You tell me what eugenics is. Yeah, it was so much darker than that, though. You're making it sound like it's a good thing. It's actually so much more. It's so dark. Does anybody else know? It's basically, if you take the idea of what Darwin wrote about, this idea that there are adaptable traits, right? This takes it to the next level. So what's eugenics? It's not just that, not just arrange accordingly, but if they had an undesirable trait, like they got ill, they got some kind of disease, you shouldn't treat them. You should let them die, because if you treat them, they're able to pass on those bad genes to their offspring. Right? It's this idea of let the fittest survive. Don't treat people, don't help people that actually have bad genes or bad traits or bad qualities. Let them die off, which will then sort of purify the population by not having them around anymore. Sound familiar? Sound a little like Nazi Germany. Sound a little bit like, there's all these sort of cleansing things, right? About trying to cleanse traits out of a population. This is really what started this idea of sort of eugenics. That there are good genes that should be supported and make sure they're passed on, and bad genes shouldn't. Well, how do we stop bad genes? Don't let them reproduce. What's the easiest way not to let them reproduce? Just make sure that they don't live long enough to reproduce. Right? Not good. I'm saying there's some dark stuff, some weird, history of. So you got to think about this. So when you know this, you know that he was into eugenics, you go back to thinking about why, what was his motivation for all this stuff? He wasn't just trying to figure things out, trying to like, oh, I just want to know what human variation looks like, blah, 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 blah. No. He was trying to figure out what were the good traits and the bad traits and trying to figure out some way of looking at what the variation looks like and how much people can really deviate from the norm of what is a good sort of response or bad response. And we can start to identify those things and actually measure it and actually make sure that it's recorded. We can then start to use that to figure out a way to further this idea of eugenics. Right? So now all of a sudden now it's got this sort of dark, twisted sort of underbelly to what was going on. So he's considered the father and the founder of all these really good things. But as soon as you learn this, it's like, well, maybe that wasn't so good. Right? Maybe this wasn't the motivation for all this stuff. I mean, good thing. I mean, it turned into a lot of good things sort of later on, but it wasn't good to begin with. And there's some more evidence of these eugenicist folks using sort of measurement theory and testing and stuff sort of later on to further this sort of this ideology. All right. Questions? I'm getting close to done. All right, let's talk about some more of these real quick. Okay, so there was a student of Galton's whose name was Karl Pearson. That name should sound familiar as like the Pearson product moment correlation. So he was the one that he extended Galton's early work to not just quantifying things, but actually starting to look at how things relate to each other and how you can then start to predict things from one another. So looking at statistical regression and the Pearson product moment correlation, which was developed by Karl Pearson. So using data from Galton's work, James McKean Cattel's another sort of big name in sort of psychometric theory. First, he used the term mental test, and he based his work on the stuff that Galton was doing and started to then sort of take it a bit further. Early sort of 19th century scientists, generally interested in identifying common aspects rather than individual differences. They were trying to look for the norms. What was normal behavior? So where Galton was interested in looking at the variation in behavior, looking at how things differ, people differed, they were now trying to figure out what was normal behavior, what was normal things that you should see in sort of human behavior. Differences between individuals was considered a source of error now. So where Galton was interested in this idea that people vary in those individual differences, there started to be a shift where there's basically an average sort of level of behavior or whatever it is you're measuring, and as people sort of deviated from that was considered just measurement error. It was just an issue with the measurement tool, and it could just be ignored. So this sounds, if you remember things like ANOVA or t-tests or whatever, ANOVAs do exactly that. It breaks off what is the variation between the groups, and any variation within the group is considered error or noise, and we use that to sort of basically ignore it, or we use it as a metric for how big our group differences are. But we start to treat individual differences as noise and error, as opposed to sort of being interested in the variation people have around certain behaviors or traits or responses. So there's all kinds of people all over the world that sort of was doing this. There was like the French and the Germans. So you got Johann Friedrich, I think it's Herbart, Mathematical Models of the Mind. He's the founder of pedagogy as an academic discipline. So actually studying sort of how pedagogy, how one teaches, and how actually the structure of things actually can be an academic discipline all on its own. And he actually went against a lot of Kant's theories, which were really big at the time. Is Immanuel Kant. Anyway, you got Ernst Heinrich Weber. He looked at sensory thresholds. Have you ever heard of a thing called just noticeable differences? It's like a term you hear a lot in psychology. Just noticeable difference. That sound familiar? It's like the amount of something how much things have to differ before you'll notice. So it's all kinds of crazy things. Like you can notice the difference in candlelight from from 1,000 yards in the middle of the night, right? You can sort of see the differences in lumens or something. Or if I was to play two sounds, how many decibels apart do they need to be before you can tell that one is louder than the other? So this idea of just noticeable differences is how much do things have to differ before you can tell that they're different, right? So that there was in terms of sensation and perception, this was a huge sort of advancement in looking at how do people's sensations actually change from one sensation to another, and how much can we tell the differences. There's like all kinds of weird stuff. If you Google just noticeable difference, you'll see all kinds of examples of like you can tell like a person can feel like the touch of a fly's wing on their cheek, stuff like that. Like it just these are all. Or if we were all sitting in a room and I changed the temperature, how many points, how much change in temperature would there need to be before you could tell that it was hotter or colder? Like these are all just noticeable difference types things. You got Fechner. Again, I think German, Gustav Theodor Fechner, Mathematics of Sensory Thresholds of Experience. So going forward, you got the Weber, all right, Weber-Fechner law, first relates sensation and stimulus, considered by some the founder of psychometrics. So even though I said that before, he's that Galton was the first to have a psychometric laboratory. He's considered by some that Fechner really was the sort of founder of psychometrics. He was also the founder of psychophysics, and considered one of the founders of experimental psychology in general. Fechner influenced a bunch of people. One of them being sort of Freud. That Sigmund Freud was influenced a lot by Fechner's work. But in terms of psychometrics and experimental psychologists, you got Wilhelm Wundt. These names should sound somewhat familiar. Like Wilhelm Wundt is considered one of the founding fathers of psychology. First to set up an official psychological laboratory. You got Edward Titchener, who succeeded once, brought structuralism to America. His brain is still on display at the psychology department at Cornell. At least it was. I don't know if it still is, but it was at some point for a very long time. And then further sort of influence from Fechner is that he influenced this guy. Have you ever heard of Guy Montrose Whipple? Even that's a name I'm not that familiar with, but the student of Titchener's, pioneer of human ability testing, conducted seminars that changed the field of psych testing. So a lot of what he was doing at the time, he was the president of the American Psychological Association, issued its first set of standards for professional psychological testing because of his criticisms. Again, people were using tests for the wrong reasons, for nefarious purposes. So there's a bunch of standards that got put out that was because of his criticisms of psych testing at the time. So he really put, psych testing in a more sort of ethical line than where it was going. So you also got Louis Leon Thurstone. So this name probably doesn't ring a bell, but Thurstone, I remember reading a lot about Thurstone because again, he was considered one of the sort of founders of psychometric theory. Approach to measurement was termed the law of comparative judgment. He attended Whipple's seminars and on sort of moving psych testing in a sort of better direction. And he's one of the sort of fathers of modern sort of factor analysis, which we'll talk about later on. Then over in France, you got I probably shouldn't even attempt it. Jean-Etienne Esquirol, French physician. So he was a favorite student of Philip Pinel, who was the founder of psychiatry at the time. So you can see here's the sort of the clinical psychology thread as opposed to just psych testing. Now, he wrote a manuscript on mental retardation. He helped to differentiate between insanity and mental retardation, be able to diagnose between someone who was at the time seen as insane versus mentally retarded. He also started to put together this idea of measuring degrees or grades of mental retardation. So it wasn't just like you were mentally retarded or not. There were now sort of grades from sort of normal to what they called at the time low-grade idiocy, right? So attempted to develop a system to classify people into these many degrees, but found that individuals' use of language provided the most dependable continuum. All right, so he looked at a lot of linguistic markers for things like mental retardation and stuff. And I realized that the term, retarded or mental retardation, all those things have gone sort of out of fashion. Like they're seen as sort of derogatory. But at the time, like literally, the word idiot was used as a diagnostic term, right? Like these were the ways in which the language was used, and being mentally retarded or retardation, those were the classifications that they used at the time to diagnose folks who had sort of mental deficiencies or developmental problems or all kinds of things that were all sort of put into this classification. So I realized that term, as I'm saying it may make you uncomfortable, but it's the terms that were used at the time, and even though we've moved away from using them, this was like a medical term at the time that this was being done. Okay. You got Edouard Seguin, it's pioneer in training. He went a step further. So let's take Esquirel was trying to classify people and really get at a more fine-tuned sort of levels of diagnosing mental retardation. Well, Seguin sort of took it a step further, and now was trying to pioneer training. So not only do we want to diagnose them and categorize them, but now let's actually train people who are considered mentally retarded and actually see if we can actually give them skills and actually move through those gradations that Esquirel was actually trying to develop. And he rejected the notion that mental retardation was incurable, and he was the first to open a school devoted to teaching mentally retarded children. Again, this is the term they used then. It sounds weird to even say it, but 1884, he immigrates to the United States, and there's more wide acceptance of his theories, and he starts to do more experiments and stuff, trying to show that that mental retardation or developmental disabilities and things can actually be tested and treated. So they're still used today. These sort of Seguin form boards are actually still used as measures of intelligence with people who are nonverbal and have other developmental issues. These I believe are still used. I'm not a clinical psychologist, but last time I remember, these are actually still being used as measures. We get to the ones that are sort of more familiar. Alfred Binet. So this is 50 years after Esquirel and Seguin were looking into sort of their diagnostics and treatments of mental retardation. The French Society for the Psychological Study of the Child, actual society at the time, urged French ministers to develop special classes for children who failed to respond to normal schooling. Ministers required a way to identify the children. Okay, so let's set the stage for a second. So they started to think, okay, so this idea of there being developmental delays and things that actually, not only can you identify them, but you can actually intervene, right? So again, go back a second. Esquirel said we can actually measure different levels, different gradations of mental retardation, or at least developmental disabilities and things. Seguin came along and said, yeah, we can actually treat it and get people to actually move up and actually get better. So, as it started to catch on more and more, they figured out, all right, well, we need to actually change the way that they actually are schooled. There needs to be sort of special classes. You can see this is sort of beginning of sort of special education. There needs to be special courses, special classes, special sort of pipelines for these students to actually get extra care, extra treatment, so they can actually improve when sort of normal schooling, again, quote unquote, normal schooling wasn't working. All right. So they developed this intelligence test called the Binet-Simon in 1905. It was 30 items of increasing difficulty. There was a standardized administration. The same. Everyone had to say the same instructions, the same format. Everything was done exactly the same, and they created a standardization sample. So they created norms by which performance of one child can be compared to other children. Okay, so they started to do that. The way they did that, do I have it here? Yeah, so their standardization sample was 50 normal children aged 3 to 11. and some in there were considered in this sort of mentally retarded category, and they try to standardize what was sort of normal by sort of looking at this sort of sample. In 1908, they added more items. They did a better standardization of 300 kids, and here's where you get the introduction of mental age. So this idea is that they were looking at IQ. Right, so we always think of IQ is what we typically think of as what we're measuring, right? So we're taking a measure of IQ to measure intelligence. But IQ really is made up of a couple things. You have mental age, and down here you have your chronological age. So what they would do is they would use this standardization sample to figure out, all right, so if you're looking at, say, a 10-year-old kid, you look at the 10-year-olds that are in this sample and say, okay, well, how much does a typical 10-year-old know? Right? And you create a sort of a marker for what a typical average 10-year-old knows. And then you take the test, and it basically compares you to people of different ages. So if I am 10 years old, and it gives me a mental age, meaning that my mental age is the same as other 10-year-olds, right? And I multiply that by 100, times this, 10 over 10, I get 100. So the idea that an average IQ is 100 is because if your mental age matched your chronological age, it would be 1, and they would just multiply that by 100 to get an average of 100 as the IQ. So your IQ really meant that you knew about as much as other kids your age. If I am 10, but I know as much as the average 15-year-old, and I multiply that by 100, right? Then I'd have a large IQ, right? Because I'm 10, but I know as much as a 15-year-old, which means I have an IQ. I know as much as someone 5 years older than I do. Right? Make sense? Questions? I might be out of time. Yeah, 3:05. All right, so I can wrap up the last couple slides in this on Thursday, and then we can continue into the sort of review of stats and stuff at that point. So if I remember, there's only not a whole lot left, I don't think. Yeah, there's a few. I forgot about the projective tests. So there's still a few left. So we'll wrap that up on Thursday and then sort of move over into the review stuff. Any questions at this point? It's just for context. What I want you to know is the general sort of trends and things, like why did intelligence tests start to be developed around the early 1900s is because there was a need to identify mentally challenged kids or those with developmental delays, so that resources could be funneled to them to actually help them catch up. All right, so it's more about the context. I care more about the context than I do the exact dates of things. Like that in 1908, the Simon-Binet scale came along. I was more interested in sort of the why. Why did they sort of develop this? Alfred Binet was asked to sort of develop a test to identify kids, because if they were going to put more resources towards kids who needed the help, they needed to first identify which kids actually needed the help, and how to catch them up was a different story. So he wasn't involved in the sort of how do you actually help them catch up to their peers, but at least he helped to try to identify who needed the help to catch up. And that was sort of, again, that was because people started to look at mental deficiencies, developmental delays and mental retardation differently. It wasn't like a death sentence or a life sentence. It was something that could be treated, things that could be identified, and that really started nearly, almost a century before, right? So it took almost a century So at the start, to lead to it to be sort of a widespread sort of testing and administration across in France, and then what we'll talk about next time is that it then was brought over to the United States and renormed for U.S. respondents. But again, there's this idea: Terman was a eugenicist. Another eugenicist peeks in here. So was Terman really trying to identify kids to give them help? So let's identify kids who have developmental delays to give them help? Probably not. They're probably trying to figure out what kids have developmental delays so that they can actually divert resources away from them. But that's not how it ended up getting used, luckily, but that's probably what the motivation was in the very beginning. Anyway, so yeah, just get a general sense of the progression, but the exact dates, I'm not going to be like, in what year did blah, blah, blah happen? I'm not going to do that. Mm-hmm.